Hi, the topic that I chose is the Black Death in England, specifically from 1346 to 1353. Other aspects of this topic that I will be covering is both the economic as well as cultural shifts that happened as a result of the plague. The plague first popped up in China, but quickly made its way to Europe. It affected the smaller towns first. Since only the smaller towns were infected, the government did not see this as their issue. People were still going from town to town and operating as normal. This was one of the reasons it spread so quickly. By the time the government saw the plague as an issue, the smaller towns were already mostly wiped out and the plague had made it into the cities. Now, from 1346 to 1353 is when you are going to see the true heights of the plague. At this point, people are dying left and right, and in the spring of 1349, over 200 people were being buried in London a day. Since the death toll was so high, the economy completely collapsed. Most, if not all, normal procedures were halted, and even wars that were going on during the time ceased. By the end of the plague, one-third of the European population had succumbed. The end of the plague brought both an economic and cultural turnaround. One example of this was the breakdown of feudalism. Since the population was so diminished, people of the lower classes began to call for a higher standard of life. They demanded higher wages and only rented out desirable properties. Because of this, lords lost much of their wealth and power, and many of them were forced to sell their land to the church since they simply couldn't afford it anymore. King Edward III did not appreciate this new change, so he responded with the Ordinance of Labors in 1349. And this was an attempt to freeze the lower classes' wages to the amounts that they were earning before the plague. This attempt was a failure, of course, and the economy and the culture had been changed forever. Now, the bacteria that caused the plague is called Dicerna pestis. I think I pronounced that correctly. And this was spread by infected rats, fleas, as well as other pests. Now, once the plague was inside the human body, the people were able to spread this as well. Now, what surprised me? I was surprised that the economy turned around so quickly. I expected it to be in a slump for many, many years. And however, most of the tolls only affected the rich, and the lower classes were able to enjoy a higher aspect of life. Now, I wasn't aware that there were multiple types of the plague. I found this really interesting, and one of the reasons why people were so freaked out is because these multiple strains of the plague that, of course, since they didn't have microscopic technology, they weren't able to realize they existed. Now, of course, there is the bubonic plague, which affects the lymph nodes, and that's what causes those huge swelling bubons. Then there's the pneumonic plague, which affects the lungs. And then the most deadly of the three is the septicemic plague, which basically caused septicemia inside of these people's bodies, and their limbs would turn black and they would die pretty much the same day that they got it. Now, one of the other interesting things that I found was that body disposal was not really regulated. It was mostly done by people who weren't infected with the plague yet, and it kind of became a private business. Now, I thought that was super interesting. Now, another thing that was fascinating to me was that they actually had a understanding of quarantine. I didn't think that they would really have one at that time, especially since people were still going from city to city for so long when the plague affected Europe. But they actually did because they closed down ports and people were allowed to leave cities, but they weren't allowed to enter them. And I did not expect this at all. And another surprising thing that I found were plague doctor masks. I didn't realize that they looked this funny. Like the traditional plague doctor poster kind of hyped me up for a really like a cooler looking mask. So I didn't expect for them to look like this, and I just find it absolutely hilarious. I was both underwhelmed and highly excited when I found this image. Now, what sources helped me and why should we care about the Black Death? Now, The Black Death in English Towns by Richard Brittenell was a wealth of information that really helped me out. He kind of covered a bird's eye view of the plague, and it helped me learn a lot really quickly. And beyond that, his writing was engaging and it was just a fascinating read. And another thing that really helped me was the Ordinance of Labors, because it really showed off how the culture was changing and the higher classes did not appreciate this, and that they really wanted to kind of roll back things to before the plague, which, I mean, it makes sense. They were in more power at that time, so of course they would want it to go back to that. And it just really is a fantastic document that shows off how different people's mindsets were after the plague, since it failed so miserably. And why should we care about the plague? Well, it was a huge turning point in history. Like, the world will never be the same after the plague. Not only because of the population decrease, but because people were more interested in health. Religion became slightly less prominent after the plague because it really crushed a lot of people's faiths. And another reason is it's just a terrifying but fascinating point of history to look back on. And beyond that, it's also a fantastic guide on what not to do in an epidemic. When people are being infected left and right, maybe keep them inside, things like that. And so it's just as a fantastic example of how a pandemic could be handled in literally the worst way possible, because it could have really been affected. Now, granted, they did not have a great understanding of medicine, but it still is a good model for modern scientists to look back on. And these are just all of my sources for both this presentation and my paper.